Okay, I'm back, but let's try that again. Toot, 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 toot. Toot, toot, toot. Okay. All right. Not sure if this is working or not, but yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of that this season. I think the internet is the all the internet providers are all kind of already working at overcapacity, and then you know tropical storms are not helping. Um, so I'm going to attempt to. So what was the last question? So Joe had asked a question about the connection between body mechanics and stepping and cutting, and I think they were trying to at least, yeah. See my last video for that. No, I went over that. Uh, but yeah. So I do think that they were trying to make a general connection and also let you know when something was in reach or not. Um, I guess my next question would be my next question would be to all of you. Um, is there anything else about stepping and cutting or thrusting or anything from that ilk? I want to just kind of give a buffer minute for anyone who wants to kind of click back in to click back in. I feel bad that it cut out as such. All right. So let me go back to the normal world here. And back. Um, does anyone have any? All right. So, um, as I said before, the next subject I wanted to kind of dive into, if Liliana's here, which I hope she is, I wanted to talk about scabbards and swords. The question's been kind of popping up on the Discord, uh, and so I just wanted to reiterate some stuff that I said before, which is, we're going to be talking about scabbards and swords and scabbards and sharp swords, and just kind of remind folks that, when we're dealing with swords, we need to remember that they are weapons. It's very easy when we are playing we do kind of consider fencing to be play, and the fetters we normally use are blunt, and though they are equally a dangerous bludgeoning weapon, but sharp swords are kind of like the next level. I always like to say we should treat sharp swords with the same respect that we would treat a loaded gun. Um, it can harm you at any moment, and it's always going to be the moment you least expect it. So they always require a set, a very focused moment, or a very present mindset. Um, and so that being said, uh, the first thing is like I wanted to just kind of lay out uh, my thoughts on different weapons and scabbards. Scabbards are a very classic thing. we see them in drawings and paintings, and we read about them in certain texts. Um, I think that and part of my general warning is that what I meant to add is that unless you have received training, like one-on-one in-person training about drawing sharps and scabbards, I highly recommend you wait. Um, Blunts are a little different, but nasty things can still happen, so please be careful. Blunts are a very good way. Blunts and scabbards are really good ways of training that before you move to sharps. So yes, they are historical, but I do not believe the longsword is typically done as a weapon drawn from the scabbard, for say draw cuts and things. From my understanding, hand and a half swords maybe, but then hand and a half swords are also, to a certain degree, we are very rarely finding swords of appropriate length for us to be using. Like I myself should only be using about a 30-inch, 31-inch hand and a half sword, which I do actually. I have arms and armor Tauton, which I use for cutting now. Very, very happy with it. It was the right weight, the right length, etc., etc. It's a sword that I could probably remove from a scabbard. But for the most part, long swords, a dueling weapon, or a fencing and or dueling weapon, would be in scabbard and set across the arm. A lot of this is also coming from some drawings, but also that I've seen. I mean, yes, it would be carried at the belt, but I feel as though it's been more of a parade, more prestigious thing. Or if you're on a horse, that can sit pretty low and provide that extra draw space. But from the hip, long swords can be very difficult, and also often dangerous to draw. Things like messers and side swords and single-handed I-33 swords, much easier. And some of this is extrapolation, and some of it is from we see a lot in some paintings where people will be drawing a sword, but a lot of times sword is removed from the scabbard and set aside before the engagement. A lot of long swords are carried on the left shoulder, and the scabbard or on the arm, and the scabbard was kind of tossed aside. Before the Zufechten and the engagement occurs. I think partially keeping, is my opinion, also having read then research on particularly like German medieval law, part of the reason they would keep the scabbard by your side was to in fact make it in certain ways difficult for you to draw the sword, right? So that way you couldn't just walk around and use it in public. So it made it safer for the aristocracy, generally safer for most people to have the aristocracy have to wear these things. And again, only certain people were allowed to have them. So there's also that. So that being said, I'm willing to field some questions about that beyond that. I don't want to, at least today, go into specifics of doing it. I, in general, feel uncomfortable talking about mechanics of doing it because I feel as though that is something that must be taught in person. But I'm willing to field questions if people have them. People are interested in, let's see if I might have it saved locally, but it might be on my other workstation. But there are some really, really great, in terms of Messer, there are some really great Liliana asks, my question, did I lose again? Okay, now we're back. Liliana asks, my question was about the historical accuracy and art. Like you mentioned, I've also seen a lot of art depicting people wearing swords on their belt, and I assume they were long swords. Seems to be longer the sword, the more difficult to draw from the hip. Maybe they were hand and a half sword. Yeah, the longer the sword, it is more difficult it's going to be to draw from the hip. Um, Long swords are not always. It's one of those weird things. Hand and a half swords are long swords, but not all long swords are hand and a half swords. Technically, a hand and a half sword. I forget the exact numbers, but there's a certain like range of okashot types that are technically hand and a half swords, and then there's like long swords in general, and then there's like other like very specific dueling long swords that are different okashot types. Um, I forget the details. This is not my field of study. That particular thing is not my field of study. Um, uh, but, um, but yeah, the longer the sword, the more difficult it will be to draw from the hip. Um, and even if you get the right amount of, I'm trying not to use Japanese terms here, but the right amount, the right motions in order to clear what we normally use, to, like the right body mechanics to try to clear the sword, it's still too long. It's part of my argument actually with a lot of Hema fetters is they are setting the standard of people having swords that are too long. I think there should be a lot more customization or more range of options of sizes for both fetters and sharps. Um, just because something at a museum has a certain set of dimensions doesn't mean that that is something that is that sword and that should be the standard of that sword. Um, um, for a lot of reasons. Um, every piece back, historically would have been built custom for a person, and I think that uh, I know it would be very expensive to make things custom for everyone, but I think there should be a variety of sizes, more sizes available. Um, yeah, so like having a really like a 36-inch sword at your hip, if you're my height, ain't gonna work. You're not gonna be able to draw that very easily, or if you do, it's gonna be very difficult. Um, I think a lot of, and also a lot of like the hand and a half swords, like we talked about First Ward. Why First Ward is called First Ward to a certain degree is because it's a way to like when it's a position your hand is in when you've drawn a sword out of the scabbard, and like so the first parry is this. But that's other kind of things. Um, and So I think with historical, if you look at some of the dueling weapons they were using at the time, which we have access to, there's no way that they um, would have been used in like drawn from scabbards. I know there is like some side sword. There's a lot of talk about side sword use of scabbards, but also this references my limited knowledge of Fiore. There's plays where they talk about using the scabbard, and there's a couple of Messer plays like this too, where you use and also Paladini's rapier, where the weapon is implied that it can be in scabbard for transport, um, and boom, um, and you use the scabbard to parry, and then like draw from there. Um, which is something that I think is valid. But again, it implies that you're not drawn. It is faster to just move the whole scabbard, and the scabbard's not attached to your belt, right? Like if you in those plays, I'm assuming that the sword is tucked into your belt, or you're carrying it on under your in your hand, or over or under your arm, or even on your shoulder. Um, to do these things and then throw the scabbard away and then engage. Um, Justin says it would be useful if archaeologists were always able to pair the sword slash artifact with exact dimensions of its own. Actually, yes, that would actually be really helpful, wouldn't it? I mean, I think in some cases they kind of have that approximated. Like if you look at the suits of armor, you kind of get an impression of um, uh, the owner of it. But I think there's a more limited pool of this, and you see some of these swords too, like that the harness fechten, and then like this almost montante for the persons that sees offensive of that. Um, um, but yeah, so um, one of as I was saying, yeah. So you have some Fiore play, you have some plays from certain systems like um, some Messer systems and some Fiore and some Palladini um, that imply that you should be using the scabbard as part of the defense, which implies that it shouldn't be directly attached to the belt. And also, I think when it comes to art, I think we make a lot of mistakes um, in terms of how accurate we think. Um, so in terms of art that depicts what I assume were long swords and wearing scabbards for them were probably smaller hand and half sword instead. Most of the times I see them and they are there with half swording, which may be for the short swords. And also, I would assume hand and hand chiropractic sword. Check out and considering the messer as a tool someone would be using. Yeah. So two different thoughts there. Let me get virtually on his thing first. Because I was kind of getting to actually a very similar point. Like one thing to kind of think about as well is the idea that art doesn't always represent reality. Um, Again, if you just look at the written language, there's a lot of exalted language being written about how awesome people were when people were probably assholes. Um, but in the same way, like if it made for just because it made for a good portrait doesn't mean it represents reality. It might have been on the belt might have been a formal way of wearing these things, um, uh, and and all so even if it's a long sword at the hip, it might have been a very nice like a formal way of presenting the carrying of that sword. Because don't forget, there's a whole time period in which people were carrying around side swords, or the small ones of pointed the needle sword. Um, but they were hardly ever used. They were just there as a decorative thing, right? To say, hey, this person's important and rich enough to like wear wear a sword. I think that we also have a mistake. I think a lot of Hema interpretation has the mistake of having watched too many having watched too many movies or Game of Thrones, which or samurai movies or something, and it kind of builds an interpretation of what people think, um, uh, how believe these things should be used. Like how through art, and art I think art is very good for commenting and making a point about greater pictures of things, but I think is very bad. It's a very bad way of trying to extract details of historical accuracy, if that makes sense. Even in the fact books, honestly, even in the fact books, I think when you have a guy with 2 left hands and 4 left elbows, it's like, it becomes difficult to want to take it overly seriously. And also, if people are posing for these portraits, they're going to try to dress formally. It's not like they could delete the selfie. Someone was going to sit there and draw them for hours. So a number of things. It might have just been a more comfortable way to wear the sword for having to sit still for long periods of time. Like, yeah, Dina makes a really good point. Remember that a lot of art is for patronage, so they want to make a nice portrait. Boom, right? And like anyone who's done any, like even if you think about the photograph, like the portraiture of like the old daguerreotypes or something, or tintypes, it's like it took a long time to process, and that was only a few minutes. People had to like have their heads propped up and all these sorts of things. Uh, um, and then Tiny Mountain states, I would assume hand carry / tucked into the belt would check out when considering the messer as a tool someone would be using a lot during their day. Yeah, I agree. And there's also a lot of uh, messer carrying. I've seen portraitures of like uh, people like carrying portraits of peasants, like background peasants, um, where it's kind of the messer is kind of just slung around them, blade just hanging out, and it's literally just kind of like a tie or a piece of leather strapping, kind of keeping it connected to people. Because yeah, as also pointed out, the messer flopping around on the hip is very annoying because it's really hard to pull it completely behind you if it's not already tucked into something or chucked away. I should clarify the art I've seen depicted. Lots of people in battle wearing them. Maybe those would be arming. So, I mean, like a group. Yeah, I mean, also those things are staged too. Like, don't forget, these are not battlefield artists. um, I mean, maybe they're arming swords. I'd have to see. I'd have to see some of the images. Um, uh, Again, it's patronage. They're probably arming swords if they're going into war. I don't think there's a lot of longsword use in warfare itself. It's not a warfare weapon. It's not. It's a really impractical warfare weapon. Leland, if you want to dump it in the Discord, I can pop in there and take a look. Um, uh, yeah, there's not going to be an artist. There's very unlikely that there's an artist there. He's probably going based on some like people telling stories, or and actually a lot of times, maybe I'll show an art documentary on Friday after the normal fun movie. Um, but a lot of times people were brought in to stage these images to model and pose for these things so that the artist could sit and make draw interpretive. Let me see, really, I just dropped this in the Discord. Yeah, I mean, again, those look like they could be hand and a half swords, um, and the art here is again, even though those are quite long, one has to ask. There's a lot of armor going on here, um, and so what I'm seeing is two images. I'm not quite Liliana's not quite sure where they're from. I'll see if I can. Let me see if I can drop them in just so I don't sound like a crazy person examining space or nothing. Hold on 1 second, folks. But again, it's probably people, especially from that time period, if um, probably telling stories to an artist who's ended up creating it, and that could be based on a lot of different things. And again, I try not to hold art up as a lens to reality. But again, this could be based on a picture that's staged. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to switch over now. Boop. Yeah, you see longer swords, but they are. It's not exactly the most high art. It's also not if one wanted to judge this painting by perspective and qualitish, it is it's not exactly the most. In general, there's good proportion, but it's inconsistent, and people don't look like that. But that's just me. Again, I'm not an expert in this. I can only give assumptions based on my personal experience, education, and experience in prior education. Yeah. Now there are some. I never got to find. I will find it. I don't think it's on this computer, but there is some Talhoffer image. Because a lot of time, what is one thing that is interesting is that if you look at the Talhoffer materials, a lot of times he interchangeably uses the word oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be able to talk about that stuff. Talhoffer frequently interchanges the word messer and sword, which I think is, but in referring to the single-handed sword, which can also be used two-handed sometimes, which I find interesting. This one image. But it's there's a really great Talhoffer image that shows someone drawing a scabbard. It's kind of done by a sword from the scabbard by the hilt, but it's clearly like a one-handed sword. It's in the Tall Hopper Mixed Weapons segment. It's in the new book. If anyone's gotten a chance to see the new within our book from Chittister, it is released a leather-bound hardcover book of the Tall Hopper, and it is it's something gorgeous. I'll tell you what. Let's see this one. Oh, hold on, it's mixed weapons. Hold on your butts. Here we go. The correct stance for hold on, folks. Have success. Thank you, Apple. Just get this in this window. Now there's something going on around the hip, but I actually think that it is stitchings on the pants. There we go. And it says use for a scabbards in using for a bastard sword, or which is a 1.5-hand sword, or a messer, which is kind of Tallhofer kind of uses those things interchangeably. Leon comments that one thing I noticed about my sword belt pretty fast is you could take it off or on really fast. But I do think that seems interesting. Yeah. Quick release, so you can take the belt off. Yeah, I mean, I think that these are. There's a lot of experimentation still to be done. But again, considering that long swords are most likely dueling weapons, and very briefly used in warfare because they were not very efficient battlefield weapons for this reason, partly this reason. But yeah, quick release sounds really good, and I'm also pretty big fan of putting the scabbard on the small of my back and pretend it's not there, or taking the scabbard out and throwing it at your opponent. That'll distract them real nice, right? Yeah, and that's all I got about that. It's just about 8 o'clock now, so wanted to start wrapping up. Does anyone have any final thoughts, questions, comments, war stories regarding scabbards, or the piece of the Zettel we talked about today, that kind of footwork and your hewing or your striking, or any of the actually, Dina, that would be pretty funny, getting one of those hexagonal tripod releases with a little thumb tab. I'm also wondering if they had a medieval version of that where it would be tied on by a rope, if the links were held maybe little pieces of leather lightly tied together that you could just pull string and then come off of. Yeah, so are there any final last chance final questions regarding scabbards or biomechanics of reach, or what was the other thing, or any of the combination work? There's a relatively good representation of the first series of combination practice at the most basic level, which is really just kind of static practice. One of the things I'm going to try to, it's kind of difficult to do without having pairs of people to initiate, but there are other ways to use some of this material that we can get. Joe just posted a photo on the Discord. Yeah, that's the other one I was thinking of too. That's the framing is perfect, Joe. Uh, yeah, that is. I cannot exactly see if it's on a belt or not, but it looks like maybe there is it on. It is on a belt. Yeah. All right. That's interesting. Again, single-handed sword on a belt. Don't ask me how that laming is working, but I guess if I get it. Huh. Yeah. So, but yeah, definitely check out that. I won't let me post the image the way I want to, so sorry about that. Let me see if I can quickly pop this in just so people can see. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, so there's the image Joe was talking about. Yeah, as you can kind of see, there's a little bit of this really thin scabbardy thing going on here. It doesn't really look like, it looks like it's tied to this thin little belt. And the person is holding on to that scabbard while they were doing a laming, some kind of like laming thing. Yeah. All right. So another question coming in. I guess I'd have a question. Should have any recommendations for smaller swords? I know you mentioned armor, but I can't seem to find a non-custom one on there that's much shorter than my Steward. I've been hunting for a smaller sword for a while. Yeah. The smallest longsword I've been able to find so far essentially has been the Towton, which I lucked out because it is essentially probably the longest longsword I should be cutting with. And that is it's about 31 inch blade. I know you can do. I would highly recommend. No, it's fine. Since we're just wrapping up, it's always good to have questions. Um, I would say reach out if you have. They are really cool over at Arms and Armor, and if I highly recommend to reach out to them, and something I'm actually going to be doing hopefully in the not too distant future, barring work opportunities, with a Federschrat. But the idea, they are very receptive to like, hey, can you make this, but like 29 inches long blade, same blade profile, same thing. I highly recommend the Towton sword. Um, I think it has a really good blade profile that is both good for cutting and thrusting. And just reach out, just email them and ask them like, and just ask for a quote. Just be like, hey, this is what I'm looking for. Can you send me a quote? They are super nice, and always looking to help potential clients out. I've had nothing but good experiences with them, um, and so as long as you're clear about what you want, and talk to them, and they'll be more than happy to send you a quote. Yeah, we hung out with them a bunch at Long Point, and they're just super cool, and they love what they do, and they love the people who do the sword thing. So check them out. Definitely, just like I said, just drop them an email. And again, I hate to push the Towton, but it is definitely a sword profile that um, they let me borrow their laptop at Long Point when I needed to do schoolwork. See, that's so cool. Again, that's just it's just awesome people. And yeah, again, I suggest the Towton or a similar blade profile because it sits nicely in that realm of. It operates really well as a thrusting sword, which is a lot of the Lichtenauer art, and also as with a reasonably good cutting, actually very good cutting abilities. So, all right, yeah. So yeah, so for this Friday, let's all keep an eye on the weather, and maybe we can try to do a in-person, socially distanced in-person class. If not, I will be doing the Zoom again, um, Zoom or Google Meet, depending on what we can get to work. hopefully the internet will not be a butt. All right, so that it's a little after 8 o'clock. Thank you all for joining me. Please check out the Ko-fi here. If you get an opportunity, please working for tips and check out. Also, if you get a chance, check out the class that we shot the previous week, posted this for this weekend. There's some stuff in there. Have more materials for you soon, and I look forward to talking with everyone again on Friday. All right. Good night, everybody.